Thank you for coming today. I will start with a confession. I was worried that there would be an inadequate number of people present this afternoon, and it's very comforting to see how wrong I was. It was Dad's wish that there would first be a private family event and then later a more public occasion. And it's a good way to do it. This has been a very difficult time, but what we hope this afternoon is that we will be able together to focus a little more on celebrating Dad's life, because really celebrating is the right thing to do. Dad was a funny, energetic man who loved the company of others. So what better than to gather together and remember some of that joy that he brought to us all. Our numbers are not limited to those of us in this hall. Dad was too powerful a force to be contained in any one place. This event is being broadcast on the internet. As I speak, we are being watched by friends and family in London, Oxford, San Francisco, Michigan, Colorado, France, Spain, Ghana, South Korea, New Zealand, Mexico, and most exotically of all, Wales. So with that far-flung international interest, why do we meet here in Manchester? Dad was half Cornish and half American. He was brought up in the south. He has family spread out across the globe. It might be expected that the proper place to celebrate the life of a legal luminary would be at Middle Temple, opposite the Royal Courts of Justice. Well, anybody who expected that did not know my dad. He was an adopted Mancunian, but a Mancunian all the same. He built a life and a practice here. He became recorder of the city. He has his name inscribed on the wall at Manchester Cathedral. When he went down to London to sit as a High Court judge, he did so as a Mancunian and a Northern Circuiteer. His children say Bath and grass, and we consider bread rolls to be balm cakes. Dad told me shortly before he died that he considered himself at first in Manchester to be something of an outsider. He may have started here as an outsider, but he ended up as part of the scenery. It is also particularly fitting that we should meet here at Manchester University. One of the things which Dad loved most about his work as recorder was the civic aspect of it, and in particular the links with Manchester University. Dad attended numerous events here. In 2011 he came to University Place just over the road to hear Andre Geim talk about his work on graphene. It made such a lasting impression on Dad that, for reasons best known to himself, parts of his Father of the Bride speech at my sister's wedding included a discussion of graphene, together with a useful overview of the development of English planning law. As that anecdote indicates, Dad's work life and his personal life were inseparable. Discuss personal matters with my dad, and he would find a way to work in a quick war story from his life at the Manchester Bar. Appear in front of my dad in a case, and he would find a way to invite you into chambers to talk to you about his children and grandchildren. Advocates who wished to curry favour with my dad had to become very good at feigning interest in photographs of weddings and babies. So in remembering Dad today, we need to reflect him both as a man and as a lawyer, and the speakers we have today are able to speak to both parts of his life. Yesterday, I wanted to take some time to reflect and to gather my thoughts. So I went for a walk around Southern Cemetery. For those of you who don't know it, it's a huge graveyard 2 or 3 miles from here. It is a good place to remember my dad. It is a spot filled with history. It is a monument to civic pride, and particularly important for him, a tribute to the wonders of municipal planning. It is also a great slice of Manchester. Buried there are John Rylands, Sir Matt Busby, L.S. Lowry and Tony Wilson. Industry, sport and the arts. The things my dad loved about Manchester. Now, if my dad was here, he would be very keen for me to mention at this point that he was at Cambridge at the same time as Tony Wilson, and he would be keen to let you know that he beat Tony Wilson in a debate, together with Charles Clarke, the future Labour Home Secretary, I know that story because Dad told me perhaps a dozen times. I had never until yesterday seen Tony Wilson's grave. By sheer chance, in advance of speaking to you today, I happened to walk past it yesterday afternoon. His epitaph on the gravestone is a quote from a novel called, appropriately for today, The Manchester Man. Mutability is the epitaph of worlds. Change alone is changeless. People drop out of the history of a life as of a land, though their work or their influence remains. Dad's work and Dad's influence will remain. What we hope is that the speakers today will help us remember his life, his work, and his influence. I'm not going to introduce each speaker in turn. Can I simply ask that each speaker comes to the podium in the order indicated on the order of service? And the first speaker is my uncle, Martin Reed.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very big welcome to you. It is nearly half a century ago that I was cast in one of the leading roles in Albert Camus' play Caligula, which was being put on by the Preston Society of Trinity Hall. One of the scenes in Albert Camus' play involved 6 poets. 2 of them were speaking parts and were cast at the beginning, but there were 4 walk-on roles. And the director solved the problem of finding those poets by going to the JCR bar and seeing who was propping it up. This is how Andrew Gilbart came to be the 6th poet in Albert Camus' Heiliger, and how come we got to know each other. I don't think we would have got to know each other very well had it not been for the fact that Andrew's digs were in the south of Cambridge. And because I was a Peterhouse man, we walked down through King's Parade and Trumpington Street together. And this is how we became friends. It was actually a very surprising friendship. Andrew loved endless political debate. I was a natural scientist and found it difficult to get a word in edgeways. But there was something about Andrew. He was big-hearted, he was warm, he was engaging. And so we became firm friends. Now, when the time came for me to leave Cambridge and do my doctorate at Oxford, Andrew enjoined me that I needed to go and visit his little sister and cheer her up because their father had been ill. And Andrew's key suggestion for achieving this objective was to tell her dirty jokes. Now, Marion and I became an item. And it wasn't too long before I was invited to the family home. It was Woodside, a 17th century cottage on the A21 between London and Hastings. Andrew's parents were school teachers, and the thing you have to know about that household is it was just full of debate and argument about anything and everything. And each argument had to be laced with appropriate Latin verses and quotations from Greek and medieval philosophers. And within 10 minutes of being inside that house, I was suddenly horrified that I was having a fierce argument with the man I hope would be my father-in-law on the subject of the merits and demerits of public school. This was Tom Gilbart, Andrew's father. He was an absolutely fine man. He loved argument, but he loved doing it with a twinkle in his eye. He was a great man for bringing on young people. He cared about them, he was interested in them, he wanted them to develop. And he was a man of absolute decency and integrity. I was privileged to know him, but you will see absolutely in Andrew Gilbart what his father was, because Andrew inherited all those wonderful things that his father had. Now, because of, rather than despite of, that fierce argument I had with my father-in-law, I was welcomed into the family. And some years after my marriage, Marion's mother confided in me that she was very worried about Andrew because he was changing his girlfriends with the frequency that he changed his socks. Now, I had shared a dressing room with Andrew Gilbart, and I knew that if Andrew was changing his girlfriends with the frequency with which he changed his socks, a very serious relationship must be developing. And so we come to Andrew's first marriage to Morag, and to the birth of his children, Tom and Ruth. Some of the happiest moments of my life are when we all spent time together as a family, particularly over Christmas, with Andrew bustling about the house, expounding opinions, issuing instructions to any child that happened to be walking past the door at the time. Now, for some of us, Christmas meant going to church. That was our religion. Andrew's religion was draconing the whole family in for the Christmas quiz and indulging in an obscure Gilbart game called Botticelli that involved the participants trying to guess who a medieval Italian poet was beginning with the letter M. My best recollection, actually, my best story about those wonderful times that we had together was when my wife had yanked me off to yet another opera, and Andrew was staying with us, and my son had brought some friends round, and Andrew had decided quite rightly that he would go to bed. Now, after a while, my son Lawrence said he could hear some shouting, some banging. Well, he didn't think too much about it. And then there was more shouting and more banging. And after about 15 minutes, Lawrence thought he probably ought to go up and see what was going on. And the door to the bedroom room had jammed, which meant that Andrew couldn't get out. So Lawrence opened the door, and Andrew said to him, "Didn't you hear me banging and shouting, Lawrence?" "Oh, I am sorry, Uncle Andrew, but I thought you were just reading the newspaper." Well, the years passed. Andrew became a true Mancunian. He became a QC. His first marriage ended. He was divorced, he was lonely, but wonderfully he found happiness a second time with his second wife, Paula. And he acquired a family of 3 teenagers. It says so much for Andrew that he helped and he supported them. And he became accepted and valued and loved by all of them. There's no better illustration than this for me than Ted, who spent so much of his time in Andrew's dying moments with him in hospital and was with him right till the end. Andrew's marriage with Paula also brought great happiness in their cottage in France. I think secretly Andrew was back in his childhood. He was out in Woodside, he was chopping wood, and he was living the country life. But the other great thing about Andrew was the way that he threw himself into life in France. He improved his French, which really needed improving, and he made so many French friends. This actually was one of the core things about Andrew Gilbart. He was an open person. I can remember years ago when he was staying with us at Christmas. Andrew loved to cook. He also loved to choose his own wine, but he would tell you that the man he bought his wine from had a son called James, and James had had an unhappy first marriage, but he was okay now because he'd met a girl called Sandy, and that was fine. But the third child of the guy that sold him things was going to university, and Andrew had been giving him some advice. This is absolutely Andrew Gilbart. I can remember FaceTiming him while he was in hospital. And there would be various people sometimes in the room. There would be someone bringing him something to eat. There would be a hospital porter. And Andrew would introduce me, and he would tell me about their lives. There was something that was absolutely open about Andrew. He would deal with anyone at any position in society with the same interest and the same love. Andrew's last years were difficult ones. He dealt with them with great courage and fortitude. He carried on. He was blessed with grandchildren. whom he loved dearly. He reached the pinnacle of his career as a High Court judge. His death leaves a big void for all of us. Andrew was big in every sense of the word. Big personality, big heart, intellectually rigorous, unscrupulously fair, rumbustious and unstoppable. He was an open, caring and lovable individual. He will be greatly missed, but in no way forgotten by any of us. He has 2 super children, and memories of him will, I am sure, be passed down to his grandchildren and without doubt to his great-grandchildren. Now, at Andrew's Thanksgiving, nothing would be complete without a silly joke. So I want to leave the men here with a thought, a very important thought, something to be wary of. If you're thinking of chatting up any young women, please do not follow Andrew's advice. Do not tell them dirty jokes. You're likely to be tweeted to death and probably arrested. Thank you.
I was fortunate enough to have been instructed by Paula numerous times when she was in practice as a solicitor. I'm very touched to have been asked to contribute to this wonderful celebration of Andrew's life. And my instructions this time are to confine myself to resembling advertisements for traditional and trusty undergarments. Be brief, be personal, and be uplifting. I shall do my best. I met Andrew for the first time 36 years ago when he interviewed me for pupillage at 460 the Royal Exchange. He struck me even then as a reserved and diffident man, and I learnt quite a lot about his practice during the course of the interview. Naturally, he took the lead in my interrogation by the whole membership of Chambers at the final interview. And as I was later to find out, as being commonplace at such meetings, an argument broke out between him and another more senior member of Chambers. The argument occupied almost the entire interview, and I became a pupil in Chambers without opening my mouth. So impressed with my bravura performance was Andrew that he took me as his own pupil, and I took up occupation in his smoke-filled room in the unpretentious premises of the Royal Exchange in 1983. In those days, Andrew had a mixed practice in crime and general civil work, but with a developing series of exploits into the sun-filled uplands of town and country planning. From the beginning, he called me Toots, or sometimes my dear fellow, and that's how it remained for the next 35 years. I recognized from the outset that he did everything, with illimitable and immoderate enthusiasm. Every case was devoured with zeal. I watched him endlessly scribbling on countless sheets of tracing paper in indecipherable manuscript while sucking deeply on yet another cigar. He soon instilled into me a love of the bar, a desire to do things properly, a love of the Northern Circuit, and the importance of looking on the bright side of life. He took me for lunch every day to tell me about the latest chapter of last night's leisure time reading on, say, the history of the Albigensian monks of the 13th century, or the letters of Pliny the Elder. Sometimes we went for lunch to a coffee shop at the side of Kendall's, where all the young dude lawyers hung out, and where the owner, who liked to call herself the waitress, would provide good food, Italian coffee, and lots of smiles. She and Andrew became and remained firm friends for the rest of his life. As for me, well, I married her a few years after. And Jane and my friendship with Andrew never diminished over the next 35 years. It wasn't far into my pupillage that Andrew started to concentrate almost exclusively on planning cases. And what good fortune it was for me to be introduced to the bright firmament of landfill site litigation and proposals for yet more motorway service areas. Frankly, I had little to add in these fields of activity. Andrew would guffaw with laughter at my inability to understand how the M56 intersected with the M62, if indeed it does, and at my woeful sense of direction. No wonder the Israelites wandered for 40 years in the desert after leaving Egypt. My final case with him in pupillage saw me watch him prosecute some posh bin men for disposing of clinical and so-called special waste when they only had a licence for general waste. Please believe me, and if you don't, then my good friend, the common sergeant of the Old Bailey, who was junior on the other side, is here today. You can ask him. So as for this licence for general waste, how the winter nights flew by preparing for that case. The trial lasted for 3 weeks in Mould Crown Court before Mr Justice Ognall, who had not long before been elevated to the High Court bench after successfully prosecuting the Yorkshire Ripper. I doubt whether the intrigue of the Ripper case held a candle to the mystique of the waste disposal case before him. But that would not have been Andrew's view. He prosecuted with accustomed fairness, but with the relish and gusto that only he could muster. And he brought that same gusto to the Chambers cricket team. If I remember correctly, the 1980s sporting programmes will testify that our team was captained by one A.J. Gilbart. The batting was opened by A.J. Gilbart. The bowling was opened by the said A.J. Gilbart, who I think on occasions also kept wicket. But I have a recollection of him being our first change bowler in one match after a spell from our beloved fellow member in Chambers, Basil Garrett, a criminal barrister who could secure acquittals only by reciting passages of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas to the jury. Basil's spell of bowling ended when his old school tie was no longer able to hold up his trousers, and he made way for the demon first change bowler. Andrew came into bowl off a run-up of at least 200 yards. White shirt billowing in the breeze like the sails of the clipper ship Thermopylae, teeth gritted in determination and sheer undiluted pleasure. It's possible that the run-up to the wicket and the repine growl on releasing the ball were more menacing than the actual trajectory of the ball. But who cares? It was the gusto that counted. Andrew became one of the most prominent planning counsel of his generation, as both a senior junior and then as a silk. He was doubtless a household name in the tidy homes of local authority personnel and town planning experts, whom he would rip to shreds at inquiries dealing with the saucy topics of traffic trip generation or the meaning of the General Development Order. I always felt his disappointment at my lack of passion towards this area of work. You see, unlike me, Andrew did not feel that the most pressing issue in relation to motorway service areas was why a cheese and pickle wholemeal roll costs £6.75. But he enjoyed my teasing. He roared with laughter at my mickey taking. Why wouldn't he? It wasn't me who was the subject of a money laundering investigation after depositing in the Building Society the brief fee for the second runway inquiry at Manchester Airport. We remained friends throughout our lives together in Chambers and, of course, thereafter. Whilst he was in Chambers, we ran recruitment together for many years. And for some of those years, I acted as his deputy when he was head of Chambers. In that role, we shared much fun, no more so than his bursting into my room one afternoon, holding a letter written by a member of Chambers, an assignation letter towards a younger female member of Chambers. Just read the first line out loud, Andrew insisted. So I did. It read, "Dear Chicken Legs." He collapsed in hearty laughter with that splendid, huge, smiling face, that face that you see in the programme. He left Chambers to export his brand of application to work and exuberance for life as a barrister to a new life on the bench, about which others will speak in a moment. We spoke frequently during his years of illness. His spirit was indomitable. His determination rarely encountered. I am sure there were many dark days, but to the world outside he was nothing but positive. How he was able to return to the work of a Queen's Bench judge during his periods of convalescence and after so much surgery and treatment is unimaginable. Jane and I will never forget a wonderful afternoon we spent with Andrew and Paula at their London flat soon after his discharge from hospital following the dance floor collapse, the result of yet more unrestrained effervescence, when anyone else would have acknowledged that their days of chasses and free spins were over, not he. We said we would pop in to see them for half an hour, and we left so many hours later, exhausted from laughter, having shared so much sheer nostalgic joy. I spoke to Andrew from home on the telephone 2 days before he passed away. He sounded frail, and I knew it would be the last time that I would speak to him. Even then, he spoke about the prospect of going to Buxton for some rehabilitation. I spoke my very last words to him because I wanted to tell him what I thought, and said, "You are a remarkable man." I think he answered quietly, "Thanks, Toots." But that will not be the memory that will stay with me most indelibly, because there have been so many uplifting and hilarious moments, not least a bright idea that I had to change the format of our pupillage committee interviews many years ago, and to ask as a final question to all those attending for interview, if you could go out for dinner with any one person, living or dead, factual or fictional, who would it be? Over the course of time, we'd received some curious responses, perhaps none more so than the answer, Adolf Hitler. An unexpected response from an eager chap who we considered to be fairly worrying. And then we interviewed an enthusiastic prospective planner. Andrew asked her the question, if you could go out for dinner, etc., who would it be, he asked. There was a momentary pause before the answer. You, she exclaimed. There was a second of stunned silence before Andrew and everyone else collapsed in hysterics. Unembarrassed, unashamed, he turned to the applicant, 30 years his junior, adjusted his hair in a theatrical way and said, or asked, "What should I wear?" That's how I, and I believe so many others, would wish to remember him. Thank you.
There There was a criminal case some years ago at Preston Crown Court. The judge was His Honour Judge Gilbart QC, and the case concerned a punch-up in a Burnley nightclub. A punch-up which came to an end when the defendant threw a doorman down a flight of steps and into the street. The case wasn't so much about the doorman's being thrown down the steps as about what the defendant said to the doorman, or rather shouted at him just before he threw him. And what the defendant said was, "You effing fat bastard." You understand that I've paraphrased that slightly. Now, the expression, "you effing fat bastard," achieved some prominence throughout the case. So much so that defence counsel, who was a veteran on the Burnley and Preston circuit, by name one Tony Cross, perhaps known to some of you here, Tony Cross decided to use the expression for dramatic effect at the beginning of his jury's speech. And so it came to pass that when the time came for him to address the jury, Tony Cross rose to his full height, fixed his stare at a juror, and began thus: "You effing fat bastard." Now, suddenly sitting upright, Judge Gilbart banged his fist on the bench. "Mr. Cross, what did you just say?" And Cross replied, "I'm sorry, Your Honour. I was merely repeating the words said by the defendant to the doorman." "Yes, of course," said Judge Gilbart. "Do carry on. For one moment, I thought you were speaking to me." Now, that story, completely true, by the way, tells us two things about Judge Gilbart. The first is that, important as he was, he never took himself too seriously. And the second is that whilst there is a general rule that judges should not interrupt counsel's speeches to the jury, if Judge Gilbart ever felt an urge to interrupt counsel, it was usually an urge that he was unable to resist. I know that many people here will find the very concept of Judge Gilbart interrupting them difficult to accept, but it is true. Indeed, if I digress, there was an occasion once when one of Judge Gilbart's cases came before the Court of Appeal, Criminal Division. The appellant's case seemed to be making good headway, and a very stern Lord Justice of Appeal rounded on counsel for the prosecution, who was opposing the appeal, one Andrew Maneri, Queen's Counsel. And the Lord Justice of Appeal said, "Can it be right, Mr Maneri, that as defence counsel has just claimed, the trial judge interrupted his speech to the jury 3 times? Maneri: "Yes, my lord, that is correct." Lord Justice: "Well, what do you say about it?" Answer: "Well, my learned friend did rather well. The judge interrupted my speech 5 times. We are here in large numbers to celebrate the life of a giant of the Manchester legal scene, a giant who strode across the landscape of the Northern Circuit for about 45 years. And now I have a minute or two to talk about just 9 of those years when he was a circuit judge. He caught everyone by surprise when, in 2004, he took up appointment as circuit judge in Preston. No one had predicted that this star of the planning bar would want to get down and dirty with criminal work. He was the planning silk, after all, whose earnings, as you heard a moment ago, were the subject of a money laundering inquiry. But criminal work was still in his blood, even at the planning bar. He had always done crime, as we all did in the early years, and Andrew, being Andrew, he had done it with some vigour. At planning inquiries, his colleagues from the planning bar used to complain that he treated the hearings like jury trials. At times, he cross-examined distinguished expert witnesses as if they were convicted criminals. They would stagger out of the witness box wondering what had just happened to them. Now, most of us here know what it's like to be battered by Andrew Gilbart. Imagine just for one moment what it was like when he was being paid to do it. In his transition from the planning bar to the circuit bench, a sort of reverse process occurred. Andrew brought into the criminal arena his massive intellect and his encyclopedic legal knowledge. He was, as we all know, a brilliant judge. Firm, fair, merciful, efficient, and despite all that reputation for intervention, he was always actually willing to listen and willing to be persuaded. He knew what made people tick. He was frighteningly hard-working, and he expected those appearing in front of him to raise their game to his levels. He was generally patient if their brain power did not quite match his, but not always. There was the pompous criminal barrister who proudly and with a dangerous kind of smugness, I'll give you his name afterwards, who asked Judge Gilbart if he'd received his skeleton argument and his list of 20 authorities, all judgments of the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, which showed, it was said, that the point in issue could only be resolved in his favour. I have received your skeleton argument and your list of authorities. Thank you, Mr. X, said Andrew. I have read your skeleton argument. It would appear that, unlike you, I have also actually read the 20 authorities, and I have understood them. All this was said with a mischievous glint in his eye, but he did like to spar with gifted counsel and counsel who were well prepared. On one occasion, he was enjoying a difficult legal argument with a pair of five-star advocates. One of those is, in fact, now the leader of the Northern Circuit and is here this afternoon. And he had to break the argument off briefly to hear a short mention in another case that had been going badly wrong. And when he saw the two, so to speak, two-star advocates who turned up to mention the short case, his face fell. So as they slid into the front row and the two counsel in the other case moved to one side to make room for them, Andrew simply could not resist, gesturing out with his arms and saying out loud, "Mr. Hayton, from the sublime to the ridiculous." He thrived on the circuit bench. Working in Preston brought him back in touch with old circuit friends and off-circuit old friends. Judge Andrew Woolman had turned up at Preston to sit there from Leeds. Andrew Woolman had been an old friend of Andrew Gilbart's at Cambridge. In fact, Judge Woolman had last seen Andrew 35 years earlier at Cambridge. Andrew was last seen by Andrew Woolman on a platform competing in an inter-college debate. On that occasion, the young Gilbart had reached his grand peroration with these words: As I stand before you now, when the stage collapsed under his weight and he disappeared into the bowels of the building in a cloud of dust. Andrew found the daily commute to Preston from his home near Stockport quite a grind, but he promised to stick at it for at least 2 years, and when those 2 years were up, he went to his resident judge to see if he might apply for a transfer to a court centre nearer home. Unfortunately for him, his resident judge was His Honour Judge Peter Openshaw QC, as he then was. "What do you mean, a transfer?" said Openshaw. "You'll stay here. I'm not running an officers' training school, you know." And that was the end of that conversation. So Andrew stayed for another 2 years, but Preston, of course, was not to keep him. And in 2008, he was appointed to the Recordership of Manchester and immediately made the job his own. He thought it was the best job in the world, and in that respect he was right. It is. He was a first-class judge, but also a first-class administrator. Those two do not always go hand in hand. As recorder, he was a caring and considerate leader of his fellow judges and of his staff. He could not have been more welcoming or more helpful to me when I turned up to work under him. And he was fun to work for. The photograph on today's match programme in his recorder's robes, booming with laughter, says it all. Now, things do not always go well for judges, and Andrew was hugely supportive of members of his team who went through bad patches. Supportive, it must be said, when some rather higher up the judicial ladder were not as supportive as he was. He was unafraid to put his own position on the line. As to the staff, his recordership coincided unhappily with economic recession, and for some there was redundancy in the air. Andrew fought to the last ditch to keep staff in their jobs. At the annual National Conference of Resident Judges, he spoke out publicly against any resident judges who did not act as he did, and many of them went back to their constituencies in a different frame of mind. There are many staff in Manchester and elsewhere nationally who owe it to Andrew Gilbart that they are still in work today. And he was loved by the staff at Crown Square. He would have been particularly touched to see here today his old court clerk, Steve Heath, and his usher, Stella, whom he adored. Probably the greatest challenge Andrew had to face as recorder was the handling of the Manchester disturbances cases in 2011. Andrew rightly ticked off any of us who used the word riot, by the way, since no offensive riot was actually committed. These were the Manchester disturbances. 190 cases came through the Manchester courts, and they were processed with astonishing efficiency. Andrew gathered together a team of his most senior judges to handle the disturbance cases. Judge Michael Henschel, now retired, Judge Robert Atherton, also now retired, Judge Clement Goldstone QC, now the Recorder of Liverpool. Now, with this formidable team, Andrew settled on a common approach to the cases and drew up a framework of likely sentences to be passed in respect of the various offences committed, subject always to the circumstances of the individual case. He did this to bring uniformity and consistency, and everyone agreed it was the sensible thing to do. Now, some of the sentences that were passed were severe, and inevitably some of them found their way up to the Court of Appeal. Unfortunately, as the day for the appeal hearings approached, a view started to gain ground that the whole approach of Manchester Crown Court to the disturbance cases was fundamentally flawed. That Manchester had stuck its neck out in trying to impose its own sentencing guidelines to be followed in Manchester and, for that matter, nationally. And that was something which, of course, no court had power to do. Andrew was naturally worried about this development. To make matters about 10 times worse, on the day set for the hearings in the Court of Appeal, as appalling bad luck would have it, Andrew was himself sitting in the Court of Appeal, obviously in a different courtroom, but close enough to suffer acute embarrassment if things went wrong. And so the Manchester disturbance appeals were listed, and they were listed before as powerful a court as it is possible to imagine. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, the Lord Chief Justice in waiting, Lord Justice Thomas, and the President of the Queen's Bench Division in waiting, Lord Justice Leveson. Andrew, as we now know, was at that time a candidate for appointment to the High Court. So he had the feeling that promotion was the least of his worries. His whole career was about to go down the pan. Now, on the morning of the appeals in London, Judge Michael Henschel, remember him, was happily sitting in his room at Crown Square without a care in the world, when at 9:30 a.m. the phone rang. It was Andrew, ringing from London, and he was clearly in an extremely anxious state. There followed a short exchange. It was an exchange which is now part of Crown Square folklore. It spoke volumes about judicial comradeship and loyalty and those unspoken ties that bind. The short exchange went like this. Henschel: "Good morning, Andrew. How are you?" Gilbart: "Michael, I am really worried." Henschel: "Worried? How is that?" Gilbart: "I think we're going to get a real kicking in the Court of Appeal today." Henschel: "We?" What do you mean, we? In the end, of course, all was well. Most of the Manchester sentences were upheld, the appeals were dismissed, and Andrew's work on those most serious of cases received the highest praise. His promotion to the High Court bench was assured, and it followed as night follows day. Now, so much has been said by others about Andrew's bravery. He faced his illness and all those treatments with a level of courage that is beyond imagining. And he did so without one word of complaint or self-pity. He set an example to us all. I will add only one postscript, I think not told before, which touches on this and on Andrew's attitude to his staff. The day when Andrew received his first bad test results, that is when he first learnt that he had a serious medical problem. That day, as fate would have it, was his last day but one at Crown Square. The next day was to be his valedictory in court. It was to be his triumphant exit to a new career as a High Court judge. With the worry about what he had just learnt about his health, he did not sleep at all that night. And the following morning he was exhausted, and his mind was entirely preoccupied. Those close to him told him to stay at home and forget about the valedictory. Everyone would understand. Andrew Gilbart would have none of it. He was due to leave Crown Square that day, and he wanted to thank his staff. The show would go on, and it did go on. And he marched into court, and he made a barnstorming speech, and he thanked his staff, and not one person at that valedictory had an inkling of what he was suffering. Andrew died on the 20th of March this year. On that day, many of his friends, opening their newspapers, could not help but notice that another sad death occurred on the same day, on the other side of the world. A death which achieved global media coverage. It was the death on the 20th of March 2018 in Kenya, after a long battle against illness and surrounded by devoted carers of the last male northern white rhino. The death of the last male northern white rhino, a beast, as it happens, known as Sudan, was mourned by conservationists the world over. The parallels between the death of the last male northern white rhino and the death of Andrew Gilbart would, I think, have amused him. He would have liked the northern bit. He was a proud adoptive northerner. And I think he would have liked the rhino bit. The last male northern white rhino was huge in stature, built like a brick outhouse, larger than life, huge in spirit, huge in heart, as strong as a rhino, with a voice that roared like thunder, thick-skinned, resolute, single-minded, irrepressible, irresistible, when on the charge, unstoppable. Good to have on your side, not so good to have running at you. Noble, majestic, gentle and kind, generous, loyal to his own. A unique example of his species, a one-off. Dignified to the very end. Irreplaceable.
It's a great privilege for me to be asked to speak today and to help to give thanks for the life of Andrew Gilbart. I want to offer you firstly some personal reminiscences of Andrew as a colleague, and then some reflections upon his time as a High Court judge. Because it's especially as a High Court judge that I got to know Andrew well. I never suffered the grave professional misfortune to ever do a case against him. I gather from colleagues he could be a bit of a handful. And so, whilst he was a friend at the bar, it was only when he came to be a High Court judge, and we were both sworn in around the same time, that I actually got to know him much, much better. And when I did, when I got to know him better, I learnt that we really were kindred spirits, that we had, some of our friends might say, in an unkind moment, that we had suffered together a lifelong and relentless titanic battle with maturity, which was somewhat ironic because Andrew never tired of telling me how much older he was than I was. He was always telling me that,
But in truth, inside and secretly, we both knew that we were about the same age, probably 12 and a half, or maybe 18 on a good day. And we both had various symptoms, but the symptoms of this terrible malady in Andrew were what made him such great fun, such a fantastic colleague to work alongside on the High Court bench. Not just, as we've heard, his irrepressible enthusiasm, but his perpetual wisecracking whenever you were in his company. His professional standard of teasing, never unkind, never a moment was he trying to show off or humiliate, but always to have a bit of fun at your expense. And let me just give you one example of the great fun that Andrew and I had whilst we were together. It wasn't long after we'd been sworn in that we were sent off on a training course, an induction course for new High Court judges. And Andrew and I, because we were the only two planners on the course, were encouraged and told that we had to speak on the thrilling subject of planning injunctions. Can you imagine how delighted we were? And in order to try and stop our audience dropping into a catatonic trance at this dreadfully boring subject, and I hadn't appreciated till Martin spoke earlier what an enthusiast Andrew was for quizzes, but he and I, with our third form enthusiasm, decided that we would spice up the interest in this otherwise terribly boring talk by including a quiz, and various rounds were devised of a planning theme. Naming motorway junctions was one of them that I can recall. And then, of course, with the third former's enthusiasm, inevitable enthusiasm for the scatological, Andrew came up with the idea that what we should have is a picture round based upon identifying the droppings of legally protected species. Now, you may wonder, as I did, where the material was going to come from in order to source this round of the quiz. But I'm pleased to say that it turned out that during the course of his professional life, Andrew had amassed an enormous collection of protected species poop, photographs that filled his hard drive. In fact, I suspect it was the largest collection of such material in private hands. Some of them were equipped with rulers, as if the ecologist was conducting some sort of examination of a crime scene, or maybe trying to work out whether this was the largest one that had ever been recorded in the UK. Anyway, our colleagues seemed to have a bit of fun, although they did put up an absolutely abject performance in terms of differentiating between the badger latrine and the otter spraint, and didn't seem to show any great enthusiasm for planning afterwards. Not only was Andrew great fun, but he was also, for me, an ever-present source of sound advice and wise counsel, provided that was that you could get him to turn his music down in his room. Oh, just listen to this bit here. No, I can't answer your question yet. Or stop fiddling with the latest titivation that he'd made to his phone or his laptop, or the latest piece of software that he was enjoying. Or, most often, actually get him off the phone, whether he was billing or cooing with Paula. I learnt from Paul Tucker that I wasn't the only one who was the gooseberry in conversations when I entered into his room. But also, when he was on the phone, one of his special tricks was to pretend that in some fictitious conversation that he was in banter with the person at the other end of the phone who was being abusive about you. So it might go something like this. I'm ever so sorry, I've got to go now. I've got Mr Justice Dove, who's just come into the room, wants to speak to me. Yes, that's right, the fat, bald, ugly one. You remember him? He seemed to recollect you rather vividly, Ian. He seems to know you very well. Yes, I know, the one who was in short trousers when I'd taken silk. And so it would go on. But when the phone went down and the coffee went on, he was always a source of encouragement, reassurance, perspective, and sound advice. As a colleague, he taught me, and I'm sure others as well, by his example, to have the confidence in the new job to be myself. It was a gift for which I will always be grateful. A gift which, as J. Penner, another distinguished judge of this circuit, recorded in her valedictory, is perhaps one of the most important qualities that as a judge you can try to exhibit. So that was Andrew the colleague, a great source of fun, a wonderful laugh and great company, a really ready source of wisdom and strength to me, in particular when I was starting off. But what about Andrew the High Court judge, the position which I think we all expected him to occupy sooner rather than later? As a High Court judge, Andrew served with great distinction. He continued to handle the high-profile and complex criminal cases that he'd been used to when he'd been on the circuit bench, and to serve with distinction in the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. But his work in the Planning Court was work which particularly played to his strength. He dealt with a considerable number of high-profile, sensitive and complex cases. Let me give you a flavour. He analysed the legality of the proposals to fell the street trees in Sheffield, the case of Dilner. He endorsed its legality, although that is a struggle for the residents which still continues. Any legal argument was comprehensively put to bed in Andrew's judgment. He had to consider and resolve challenges to the grant of licences for exploratory planning permission for fracking in Balkan, another high-profile topic which he dealt with comprehensively. When two Romany gypsies complained that the Secretary of State's policies, which had led to the recovery of the vast majority of appeals by gypsies and travellers in the Greenbelt, those policies were discriminatory, Andrew, in a tour de force in the case of Moore, did not shrink from the conclusion that the Secretary of State's policy was disproportionate and in breach of the Equality Act 2010, another highly controversial case which he handled with assurance. It's often been observed that planning operates at the febrile interface of lawful regulation and politics. Emotions in those cases ran high, and in all those cases they required an assurance and a clear-sightedness to bring them to a proper conclusion. That is what Andrew brought to all of those cases. As a judge, we all take the same oath, without fear or favour, affection or ill will. Andrew's clear-sighted analysis in those cases exemplified that judicial approach. Another high-profile case he dealt with also had emotions running high in it. Indeed, he recorded that in paragraph 9 of his judgment. The case of Lyle Mannering, or is it Lyle Mainwaring, I've never been entirely sure, and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, concerned, you may recall, the house that its owner chose to paint red and white stripes. Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea served a notice under section 215 of the Town and Country Planning Act, alleging that the amenity of Kensington was adversely affected by the condition of the land, namely by being painted like a boiled sweet. After the hearing, Andrew, in his typical fashion, and as a result of his thorough research, found a troublesome authority that none of the parties had identified. In the case of Britt and Buckinghamshire, the Court of Appeal in 1964 had, disturbingly to Andrew's mind, thought that condition of the land included the appearance of the land. In other words, that there was a freestanding basis upon which aesthetics could form part of the planning system. Now, Andrew wrestled with this, and I know that because he raised it several times in conversation. He took, however, a pragmatic and robust approach to the often inconvenient common law doctrine of precedent, and found that the Court of Appeal's distaste for the concept of a planning code had to be dismissed. It was old hat. The local authority couldn't use a Section 215 notice to complain about aesthetics, giving rise to complaint when it didn't require any form of consent for a person to paint their house like a licorice allsort. Indeed, the boiled sweet aesthetics couldn't be controlled by Section 215 by any measure at all. But with characteristic intellectual honesty, Andrew granted permission to appeal. Permission to appeal that, of course, no one took up because his answer was obviously correct. There's a great poignancy to me playing a similar role at Andrew's Thanksgiving this afternoon as he did at Francis Patterson's Thanksgiving not very long ago. They were both very distinguished judges of the planning court, and they are going to be profoundly missed by all of us who remain. Everyone whose life was touched by Andrew, as mine was, will have been the better for it. We face an impoverished future without him. I shall sorely miss his laughter, his energy, his banter and teasing, his camaraderie, as well as his good sense and reassurance. He was a wonderful colleague and a very fine judge.
May I thank all of you who have attended today and all of you who have spoken. What a fitting tribute to who my dad was and what my dad achieved. I would also like to thank all of those people, literally hundreds of them, who have written to Paula, to Ruth and to me since my father's death to share their memories of him. It has been tremendously comforting to know that it wasn't just us who loved Dad. He is remembered widely for his humour, his warmth, his humanity and his support of others. Now, no event connected with my dad would be complete without food and drink. And I want to address you very briefly before we enjoy those. The order of service says that there should be a conclusion by me. But the truth is, I don't know how to speak in conclusion of an event celebrating my dad. I delivered the eulogy at Dad's funeral. I did my best to capture who he was and to say what I wanted to say, but nothing I said felt adequate. He was the man I loved and admired more than any other man in the world. He was the man I spoke to every day. He was the man I turned to for advice, support and understanding. He was everything that a father should be and more. And Ruth and I were incredibly fortunate to be his children. There should not be a need to speak in conclusion today. It has come too soon. Given that I feel unable to do justice to Dad with my words, I thought I would ask somebody else to help me. My dad's eldest grandchild is my son George, aged 6. Dad's grandchildren, George and Martha, my children with Hannah, Alba and Romy, my sister Ruth's children with David, were hugely important in his life. But we haven't heard their voices either today or at his funeral service. So yesterday I asked George if he could give me some words to sum up his granddad, and I would read them out to you all today. I shall quote him directly. He was kind. I liked watching Star Wars with him. I liked going round to his house and him showing me old pictures and history books. I liked having big meals and parties with him, and I loved his jokes. His jokes were way better than my daddy's. Other than that clear factual inaccuracy, I think that sums up my dad pretty well. For all that he achieved in his career, he was first and foremost a family man, a husband, father, stepfather and grandfather. When I remember him, what brings a smile to my face is not a famous case or a judicial title. It is picturing him presiding over a roast dinner, surrounded by his family, telling awful laboured puns and holding 6 different arguments at once. His passing leaves a huge gap, but as we have heard today, we remember a life of joy, energy and vigour. He will be much missed. Thank you for coming today.